Welcome everybody to the October 2023 edition of the Idaho Department of Labor's Labor Market Insights Series. My name is Craig Shaw, and I'm the Labor Market Information Research Supervisor at the department and your host. Today, Lisa Grigg, our labor economist based in our Lewiston office, will be presenting on her analysis of Idaho's school enrollments and the demographics driving them. Indulgence here before we get started. I just want to give a plug to the Idaho Launch Program. Applications for that program are open now after launching last week. And again, if you're not familiar with Launch, it's a program aimed at helping Idaho high school students take their future to the next level, to quote the governor, with up to 8,000 grants for in-demand career training or occupations. And so I think our topic today certainly kind of highlights the need for that type of program for what we're doing. If you want more information on Next Step, just go to nextsteps.idaho.gov/launch. And then we'll go ahead and get started on our topic, and I'll just provide the update on our most recent unemployment rate, which was 3% for August, which is up from 2.8 in July. And Idaho's had a dual conditions of good fortune, of strong economic growth, and also the challenge of a persistently tight labor force for the last decade or better part of a decade. And Lisa's presentation this morning will be an important topic as the source of Idaho's future economic well-being rests in the next generation. So Lisa, I want to turn the time over to you and I'll let you get started on your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Greg, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to get my screen up here for you. So this project kind of stemmed from my personal curiosity of, it's no surprise that Idaho is seeing incredibly strong population growth right now. But the question is that population growth balanced equally, both around the state and by age group? And so it was kind of based on where we're going with education and where we're going both with enrollment and employment. Seeing as we're the Department of Labor, I was also looking at the employment side. But here's kind of where we went and what I found. And please feel free to, as Craig said, ask any questions. But really, the key is why this is important is because this is our future labor force. We define the labor force as those who are age 16 and over and who are either working or currently looking for work. And so those students who are coming up through the K-12 school system are our future labor force. So seeing what's happening there as far as potential numbers is something that's a key to what's going to have, again, like the next generation, like Craig said. So here we go. So here's a couple of questions we're going to look at today. And the first one is Idaho's K-12 public school enrollment following overall population trends? Again, overall population is growing very fast. And the question is school enrollment doing the same thing? And so we're actually going to put up a little poll here for all of the participants. We hope you will take a 1 second to answer it. It'll take you probably 5 seconds. But you can see the poll here. The question is, do you expect Idaho's K-12 enrollment over the next 10 years? Do you think it will either increase, decrease, or stay the same? If you could complete that survey, pick your choice, and then we will kind of go over the results at the end after the presentation. Then the next question is, what does that imply for the future labor force? So if the public school enrollment is growing, that probably means the labor force has a good chance of increasing, assuming, and that's the big if these students stay in Idaho. If your school enrollment is declining, again, there's a possibility your labor force could decline. It may not happen. It's not a one-to-one correlation by any means, but it can be forecasting trends. So here's a few headlines we've seen about school districts recently. The top two are in the southwestern region, and I picked them because Boise and West Ada are essentially our two largest school districts in Idaho, and you are seeing very different results happening. They're not that far apart from each other. Boise schools, you can see Boise schools managed declining enrollment as the top one. They have actually had 7 straight years of enrollment declines in the Boise school district. Compare that with West Ada, which is down below with Meridian, almost bursting at the seams. And so you can see that there is some migration happening out of Boise and into Meridian areas. So some of this is just redistribution of student population, right? But then if we continue on, I chose these four, let's start there, that all four of these cities that I chose have increased population over the last 3 years. So total population has grown. So Boise, Meridian, Coeur d'Alene, and Sugar-Salem all have seen, well, Sugar City have all seen population growth, but they're having different school enrollment results. If we go down to Coeur d'Alene, you can see the headline is enrollment declining. And so Coeur d'Alene, actually, its population had added 4,000 residents in the last few years, but its schools are not seeing growth. And then down at the bottom, Sugar-Salem, this is in the eastern region. This, you can see, pretty strong enrollment. We've seen 25% growth in student enrollment in the last 4 years. Sugar City population has increased by 40%. It's small. That's another thing I wanted to include too, is that Sugar-Salem has, the city has a population of around 2,000 people, so much smaller than Boise, Meridian, and Coeur d'Alene. But again, they're seeing increased growth by the schools. So what's happening here? What's causing some schools to go up and some schools to go down? Looking overall at statewide public school enrollments, you can see very strong growth and always in an upward fashion, right? The only time that Idaho did not go up, it was in 2020. We had a very slight decline. I should define, before we get too far, what all is included in public schools here. So this is not only your traditional school districts, but also includes your charter schools and your virtual schools. So those are all included in these numbers. So even if your enrollments were in a traditional school and they went to virtual school, they'd be counted in both years here. So the ones who are not included are your private schools and your homeschoolers, essentially. So the gray bars, I should also start with that, is periods of recession. So the recession started in December of 2007 and went through June of 2009. And then we had a very, very small recession in 2020 following the pandemic, which we bounced out of very quickly, but it was still delegated as a recessionary period. So again, you can see steady growth pattern. The only time we declined was in 2020. When you look at the bar on the right, you can kind of see the average number of students we've added a year. So in the whole series of 97 to 22, we've added an average of about 3,000 students. We had a pretty slow growth the last 3 years. So we added just over 2,300 students on average between 2019 and 2022. So from 1997 to 2007, Idaho added about 11%, again, enrollments over that 10-year period. We did it again in 2007 to 2017. We added another 11%. If we were to continue that trend by 2027, that would take us up to 335,000 enrollments statewide, up from the current 319,000 in 2022. This would require annual enrollment growth of approximately 3,200 students per year for the next 5 years, for a total of 16,000 students to be added. Again, that's even considering that the last 3 years were a bit slower. You can see that 2017 to 2019 growth was actually very strong in student enrollment. And this is just looking at that again as the numerical change every year. So you can see that we had some really strong years. There was 4 years in there where Idaho added more than 5,000 students a year in K through 12, and that was 2005, 2006, 2012, and 2021. 2021, I think we just bounced back a bit from 2020. But you can also see in 2022 that we went down again. So besides the slight decline in 2020, 2022's enrollment growth of 2,800 students was the lowest since the 1,900 added in 2014. So 2022 is the lowest number, excluding 2020, that we've seen in the state of K through 12 enrollment since 2014. When we look at annual growth, it's really constant. We're adding about 1% of our annual enrollment every year. And you can see again, the 2019-22 slowed. And so we added less than 1%. But again, that's partly because of that 2020, well, significantly because of 2020 influencing that number. When we compare it to population growth, so going from 1997, where both population and enrollments are based at 100, you can see how they've grown. You can see that enrollments, although it's always been behind population growth, followed a similar trend. but you can see them starting to kind of diverge and the lines really starting to widen the gap between them starting in about 2018, 2019. So what this is showing you is that annual population growth continues to be very strong. In the last 5 years, annual population growth has averaged 2.5%, but annual K through 12 enrollment has averaged 1.1% over those past 5 years. So we're essentially seeing half the growth in K through 12 schools as we are in the overall population. What could be causing this difference? Well, it could be the population growth by age. It could be that our population is growing faster in a subset of the population that's not student age, so those who are 18 and above. It can also be that we are seeing more homeschooling and private school enrollment growth. And I think that is the case, but I do want to mention I didn't have great statistics on that. Public school is easy to find, private school is not so easy. We know it's in play and we know that that's something that is happening, but at the moment I didn't have great numbers to quantify, but just public school wise, you can see our population growth is exceeding our K through 12 enrollment growth. So here's the question. Is our K through 12 enrollment growth expected to continue? And you can see at the bottom, I have maybe, perhaps, possibly, or not. It sounds a little unsure, right? The future's not clear. I don't have my magic 8 ball. And there's factors that say that it could. And there's other factors going on, which we're going to go into next and kind of break down the pieces of maybe why it won't. And is that a bad thing? We'll see. Okay, so looking at population. Population, of course, is the first place to start when we're discussing what's happening in trends, right? So let's look at this chart here. So you can see Idaho is in the orange. So this is based on 2010. So all of the index to 2010. So you can see I've got US in blue, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. So we took a couple of our neighbors, seeing as I'm from northern Idaho, I selected Montana and Washington to compare. And so we can see, looking at, if you look at the Idaho's line, you can see a distinct change. The slope ascends significantly starting in 2019. So we go off the growth path that we were doing in 2010 to 2019, and you can see that we've taken a very different course when it comes to population growth. Montana did a very similar thing. You can see them kind of in the burgundy there. And so they went from a fairly low growth rate to seeing, again, a pretty significantly higher growth rate relative to what they're used to. The US is doing something opposite. If you see, the US is growing very slowly, but it flattened the last couple of years. Same with Washington. Washington prior to 2016 was outperforming Idaho in population growth. And then Idaho has kind of kicked it into high gear, and Washington has gone the opposite direction. Just for background, between 2010 and 2022, Idaho's population grew over 23%. This is 3 times higher than the US at 7%. The top 3 population growths in this time period was Idaho at 23%, Utah at 21%, and Texas at 19%. Washington was number 8 and Montana was number 11. So between 2016 and 2019, we gained an average of 35,000 residents per year in Idaho. Once we hit the pandemic, so starting from 2019 baseline to 2022, we've gained an average of 50,000 residents per year. This is 1.5 times the level per year that we saw for the previous 3 years. And again, this should show you just how much of an outlier Idaho is. So this is by regions. So you can see the US over the 3 years has had 1.5% growth rate, whereas Idaho has been 8.5% population growth rate. Idaho is folded up in the West. So those green bars of the West, Idaho is included in those numbers. And so you can see that on both the 3-year and the 10-year, which is below, that Idaho is very much an outlier and does not look like anything else we're seeing in the regions of the US. So there's certain populations of components of population growth. And so one component is births, and you're offsetting that by deaths. So if you have more births than deaths, you have natural population growth. The other part is migration. And so 2 pieces of growth, right? Natural growth or migration. And this graph is showing you how significant migration has become to Idaho's population growth. If you look prior to 2015, half of our population was due to natural growth and half of our population was due to births. But if you look, it continues to rise and it peaks in 2021 at over 90%. So what that tells you is that in 2021, we had 9 times more people moving into the state than our natural growth rate. Looking at this a little differently, a migration to birth ratio, you can see again that from 2010 to 2019, Idaho's average was about 1 to 1. We were having about 1 new migrant for every birth. But you can see it's gotten a little bit wacky and a little bit askew the last few years. So we actually, in 2020, you can see that that number went almost to 3 times. Part of that is that our 2020 births were low, but we had extremely high, that's when the high migration really started. And so it throws this ratio really out of whack. For comparison, in 2010 to 2019, that we were, okay, 2010 to 2019, the top state with this ratio was Florida at 1.2. So they had 1.2 migrants for every birth. When you think of Florida, I think of a retirement state. I think of people who are moving there that aren't necessarily having children and families. They're moving there to retire. They're snowbirding. But when you look at Idaho the last 3 years, Idaho had the highest migration to birth ratio of all the 50 states. You can also see that on this chart that we're a fairly young state compared to a lot of the other states on this list as well by median age. We are the 8th youngest median state by age, sorry. So breaking down population growth just over the last 3 years. Again, so here we are under 18. So these are your potential school kids. Your 18 to 64 is mostly going to be your labor force, and your age 65 and up is going to be those who are looking to retire. Although some people do continue working once they're age 65 and up, the participation rate falls significantly from about 80% to about 20% by the time people hit 65. So you can see that looking here that even though that 25% of Idaho's state population in 2019 was under the age of 18, only 10% of our population growth is actually attributed to this age group over the last 3 years. So what does that mean? In that it means that we're not growing evenly. What we're seeing is that, yes, we're having huge migration growth coming in, but they're not necessarily students that are going to be enrolling in our schools. You can see we are a little bit overweight the labor force, and then we're also overweight those who are retirees. It's not all retirees moving in either. It's definitely a big range of age groups. Every person's reason is different. And I should talk a little bit, I guess, about why people are moving to Idaho, right? It might make a little more sense. And so what we've seen over the past few years is that people are migrating to places that are, one, less densely populated, have a little bit of space, and 2, that have lower cost of living. And so when you start thinking about some of those states that have a lower cost of living, you get out of the coast and you kind of head towards the Mountain West, Texas, or the South, are kind of the 3 main pockets we've been seeing of growth. So sorry, that's important, and I should have done it earlier, but that's part of the reason why people are moving here. But we're also seeing other effects of that. In 2018, Idaho's housing prices were about 5% higher than the U.S. median. Now we're about 25% higher than the U.S. median, and we're not necessarily the cheapest place to move anymore. Things are changing in that realm. Breaking this up a little further by 20-year age groups, you can see that the blue represents a percent of the total population. So if you think of your population pyramids, usually your younger age groups are a higher percent of the population than as you get older. You can see that this is true here. The largest percent of our population is in that 0 to 19. Then we have a little fewer 20 to 39s, little fewer 40 to 59s, and so on. But when you look at the red is the growth of the 3 years again. You can see that a really low amount of growth happened in that young age group. And so we're definitely overweighted in the 20 to 39 and the 60 to 70 and the 60 and up, essentially. Idaho's, that's where we kind of saw most of the population changes over the last 3 years. I do just want to mention that this is a 3-year period. Populations often change kind of glacially, but this was stunning in 3 years for me. When you're thinking about demographics, 3 years is not anywhere near a generation, but we're seeing significant changes happening as a result of migration. And so again, this is 5-year blocks. And so you can see the checkered ones are essentially the age groups that will be under the age of 18. The under 5 actually declined. And that's a big reason why this under 18 actually was a small percent, was that those who are not yet in school are a much smaller population than they were 3 years ago. And part of that, a significant part of that, is just births and lower births. If you look again, continuing down, you can see the 5 to 14 there's not a lot of them there. There is a lot of the 15 to 19s. And if we actually look at this organized by the number of the highest growth rate by age, you can see on the bottom, the 15 to 19 was the largest group to see growth, followed by 20 to 24. So even though they're not school age necessarily, this is still a young population. And that's another thing we're seeing in population mobility, is those who are usually young and don't have as many ties. So whether they don't have a family or they don't own a home, they're just starting out on their career, they often have more flexibility to move. And we're seeing that in Idaho. So despite the fact that we haven't seen that young population growth, we are still having a young population moving in, and there's still potential that those could lead to school enrollments. But the question is, will it? We don't know. And so we're going to see there's trends that say we may not. But it is a possibility, because again, these are the two largest age groups that happened over the last 3 years, was actually 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. Okay, so just looking quickly at, as you may all know, Idaho is not distributed equally by its regions when we look at population. Almost half of its population is in the Southwest, which is region number 3. You can see in the map here. And you can also see that it actually accounted for 46% of statewide growth. It held its own in 2019 to 22. Alternatively, you can see the North, which makes up 14% of the population, actually exceeded and had more immigration into the area, more growth, at growing 18% of the statewide growth. And then if you look down at the very bottom at the Eastern, instead of being 13% of the 2019 population, it accounted for 20% of statewide growth. So 1 out of 5 people, new people to the state of Idaho, were in Region 6. Okay, so there's population, but now we're going to switch to birth rates and talk about what's going on with birth rates versus population. Okay, birth rates. This is total births by year. So this number comes from the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. They post annual births. And you can see, so this gray line again, I want to remind you, is the recessions. So recession was declared in December of 2007. It went through June of 2009, and then a very, very brief one in 2020. So if you look at this is absolute number of births that happened to Idaho residents for any given year. You can see that between 1997 and 2022, the highest number of births we saw were actually in 2007 and 2008. And so for those 2008 births, they were likely conceived either before the recession actually began in December of 2007 or very soon after. But what you can also see from this is that then we experienced a sharp decline through about 2011. We kind of held steady for a couple of years, and then we've continued to fall a little bit further. And so despite that huge population growth that I just showed you, this is what's happened with total births in the state of Idaho. They continue to remain low. You can see that 2018, 2019, and 2020 were 3 very low year of births. We've recovered a little bit in 21 and 22, but we did have 3 consecutive years of birth, and we're still lower than essentially what we were almost a decade ago, despite adding 500,000 people in that time period. Okay, so this graph, to explain this one, the blue line is a time series of the number of babies born by birth year. So this is essentially taking a September to August look and then lining it up with what we saw by grade for the 2022-2023 public school year. So the orange is actually a snapshot of 2022-23. The blue is the time series that we're seeing. And so it was lined up on when my 9th graders would be born, when my 1st graders would be born, and lining it up with births. And this is what happened. And the difference you can see between the two is likely explained by migration. And again, remember, this does not include private schools or homeschools in this number. So total students of this age group would still be likely higher. So higher than that orange line, not much, but higher. And so what you can see here in this, if you look at, again, the number of births versus enrollment. So the biggest class that we had in 2022 to 2023 were ninth graders born in 2007, September of 2007 to August of 2008. If you continue looking, you can also see the smallest one, it continues on a downward trend, both births and both enrollments. Even though enrollments are higher than we'd expect them to be, they continue to have a downward trend. So by the time we get to our first graders, who were born in 2015 and 2016, you can see that there's a difference of about 3,000 students there. There are 3,000 more ninth graders in the school than there are first graders in the school. Kindergarten, again, kind of falls off. And part of the reason for that, it's not true to form. Idaho does not require students to be enrolled in kindergarten, and some parents don't. So just in case you're wondering why kindergarten is so low, you'll see it come up for first grade when they're required to be in school. But this overall is just showing you that, yes, we have much higher numbers than we had maybe projected to have in the schools, but it may not continue. As you can see, almost every grade has a drop in students compared to the year before it.
Hey, Lisa, I got a question.
Yeah.
You said there that that there's kind of a convergence there, but I would also point out on your previous slides, you kind of, and then also just our population growth, that the 2020, 2021 growth is kind of a record for Idaho and for the nation, really. I mean, we're 2021 was 3.34. I mean, rounds to 3.4, which is pretty high. So I guess when on the enrollment graph you have where kindergarten is kind of going down, we could expect that that decline we're seeing might be just kind of a nuance to the population now, but as these numbers start kicking in for the subsequent years, especially we get to 2020, 2021 kids, that numbers could go back up too. I mean, what would be your response on that?
Yeah, so again, looking at, I mean, those births of 2018, 2019, 2020, really low, but also then we had very high migration. And so it's highly possible that those kids who aren't in school yet are gonna, again, be larger than what you're seeing potentially, but I think it might be short-lived unless birth rates start to either increase or migration continues on a different pattern. Migration trends look like they're starting to kind of revert back to what we were seeing 2017 to 2019-ish. So it will kind of depend. The answer to that is I don't know. I know that Idaho births were low in that time period coming up for those who aren't in school yet, but they have recovered a little bit the last couple of years. But again, for the 2021, 22s, you won't see them in school until like 2026, 2027. So
we do have one question from the audience. It's more technical, but it's where did you find the enrollments? If someone's interested in getting enrollments specific to a district, where would you send them to on that?
The State Board of Education has fantastic data. They have statistics from teachers per pupil or enrollment history by school districts per year or enrollment by grade. So the State Department of Education, or the State Board of Education is where I found a lot of data, and that's going to be a great treasure trove if you were looking for some of this. Unfortunately, it's kind of hidden, and so you just have to explore the website. They have a lot out there, but they have a lot of really good data that will help you in that.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, moving on. So again, we compared K through 12 growth with population growth. This is that same chart, but looking at births specifically. And so what you can see is that based again back in 1997, you can see that population since then has increased about 57%, and annual births have increased only about 22%. And if you, again, kind of looking at it, it's not really on a positive trajectory by any means. Population is, births are not. Births are kind of hanging low. So since 2010, Idaho's population has grown an average of 1.7% per year. But if we look at the number of births, it's actually declined by about 0.4% every year than what we were in 2010. So they're actually moving in different directions right now. Birth rates are looking at the number of births in any given year for the population, 1,000 people in the population. And you can see that birth rates are declining, not just for Idaho, but for the US in general. It's actually a global phenomenon we're watching. Most all countries are aging, having fewer kids, having kids later in life. So we're not alone in that. I do want to point that out, that we're not alone, and you'll see that soon. But Idaho does have a slightly higher birth rate still than the US, but looks like we're kind of converging on more of US trends. We're at 11.8 births per thousand, and US is at 11 births per 1,000 at the moment. But then again, sorry, look at the time frames down here. Look at that 2007, 2008. We held really steady. If you look in the US population held really steady for a decade. 97 to 2007, we were between 14 and 15 births per thousand. And then it's just continued to drop. And now you can see we're hanging at about 11 births per thousand in any given year. Okay, so this is what I was saying. So if we look at the horizontal axis, this is our birth rate per 1,000 population. So the further on the right you go, the higher the birth rate is. This is in the year 2022. The vertical axis is our 3-year population growth between 2019 and 2022. And so you can see Idaho is an outlier in population growth when you see it way up there at the top with the highest population growth. You can see our neighbors, Montana and Utah, actually in the Mountain West. The Mountain West together had very strong growth over these 3 years, and Montana and Utah did as well. When we look at birth rates, Idaho kind of sits in the top third. So the US, you can see kind of in the red there in the middle at just about 11, and Idaho's about 11.8. But when you compare it to some of our neighbors, Oregon has the 4th lowest birth rate in the United States at under 10, and Montana again is under 10 as well. So just interesting to see how Idaho just stacks up with everyone. And I don't think it would be fair to say that this growth rate is sustainable. It's probably got an endpoint. The question is where and when. But it certainly shows you just how different Idaho reacted once the pandemic hit, where people flocked to and what drove them there. So using that same data, but showing you where Idaho ranked in percent of population under age, you can see in 2019, we were the 3rd highest at over 25% of our population. By 2022, 3 years later, we had dropped by about 1.5 points. It's 23.9%. I do want to mention that as you look at these, that everyone is aging, all these states are aging, but Idaho aged a little bit faster than some of the ones in the top bracket. And again, this is a 3-year time period. And to me, that's pretty phenomenal. I mean, this is something I would expect to see more 10 to 15 years out. But this change happened very quickly. When we look at birth rates by region, for those of you who don't always talk about regions, you can see the map on the right. The north is region 1 and has it and North Central, which are right below it, have the lowest birth rates in the state at just over 10 per 1,000 population. The Southwest, again, not much higher at about 11. And then as we get further east, we get a little bit more with Eastern having the highest birth rates. But I did also want to compare that if you look at 2007 to 2021, every single region saw a decrease. The Eastern region, although still higher than the rest of the state, dropped 30%. Its birth rate is 30% lower than it was 15 years ago. So again, these arrows are showing you these are the 3 areas where we saw significant growth. So if you remember, it was the North, the Southwest, and Eastern. Those 3 places accommodated for 85% of Idaho's population growth. But you can also see that there are different things in play when you look at birth rates. So even though the North has very high population growth, it doesn't have that high of birth rate, actually has very low birth rates. So these first couple columns you've seen before, this is just a refresher to kind of show you how the state is divided by population. And again, at North and Eastern, you can see had faster growth than their overall population the last 3 years. But when we look at what percent of the state's growth under the age of 18, similar story, but it's interesting that the North had the highest. The North had 1 out of 3 residents who are under the age of 0 to 18, essentially of the growth we saw, followed by Southwestern right after, and Eastern at 22%. then when we look at these last two, again, the percent of population by region that is under age 18, you can actually see that even though that incredible growth in the north, that it was only able to hold its own. It didn't gain the percent of its population under the age of 18, it held. And then you can also see that there wasn't really anyone that did gain, and we saw declines in the southwestern, southeastern, south central, and eastern. And so there were actually four of our 6 regions, despite phenomenal growth and despite most all regions experiencing growth, 4 of your regions had flat to declining student enrollment in these last 3 years. So here again, so just to give you an idea of how many counties, there's 44 counties in Idaho. It's not broke up evenly. There's 10 of them in southwestern. The next column you can see is the number of counties where actually the age 0 to 17 population declined. And this comes from the US Census annual population estimates is where this data is derived from. And you can see that despite Idaho having this amazing explosive growth, that 12 out of its 44 counties had fewer people age 0 to 17 in 2022 than it did in 2019. You can also see, if you look, that 4 of them were in South Central. And then if you look all the way to the right, you can actually see that South Central had the highest percent of its school districts lose students between 2019 and 22. And the interesting thing is, well, not interesting thing, but the point is that if you don't have the population in your region, you're unlikely to see student enrollment increase. It's not just drawn by particulars of, who has the highest graduation rates or who is operating on a 4-day week. It's also where the demographics, where is the age group. And so if you see those demographics actually falling in a state of increasing population, it goes counterintuitive to kind of what we expect to see. And then just kind of as an end, this is a comparison of, just because we have population growth doesn't mean that we're growing the same rate in all levels of the economy. So you can see over 3 years, our population grew 8.5%. And then if we take a step down, the labor force, again, those are age 16 and up who are employed or looking for work. We didn't grow as fast as population. We grew fast. We led the nation still in the amount of employment. We gained over 8%. Our employment rate, sorry, not our employment rate, our total employment gained by about 8%. And as Craig said, we've had record low unemployment rates. We've had incredibly tight labor market. So many employers are just screaming for people, trying to find bodies. And so even then, part of that is driven by population growth, right? As you need more housing and you need more services. There's not one estimate I've seen that says still that Idaho has enough construction workers to fulfill demand. And so there's going to continue to be a backlog for housing, but so many things go into a decision of where to move. But also looking at this, I just want to mention that if you look down at the right, K-12 school enrollment only increased by 2%. So even though total population increased 8.5%, if everything was equal, your K-12 school enrollment would be seeing 8% growth. It's not. It's seeing about 1/4 of that. And then when you look even worse at births are not increasing. If anything, they look like they're on a slight decline. But again, there is the possibility with this really young population moving into Idaho that we could see a baby boom. We may not. And so the question is, how does this affect the labor force going forward? And the answer is it could go multiple ways, and I don't have the answers. But we have a very tight labor market with low unemployment. Even before the pandemic, Idaho's unemployment was at 3% for 2018, most of 2018 and 2019. So if let's just say migration stops or slows, and if births don't pick up, what's going to happen in a generation or two is that there's going to be fewer workers out there than there are now. And so it's kind of a reality of saying this tight labor market may not be easily solved and may not be a short-term thing. We may be struggling with this for a long time. The other side of this is that we may continue to have really strong population growth, and our labor force may actually continue to grow strong, and we may be better off than our neighbors. But the question is, what's going to happen? And I want to reinforce that today's students are the future labor force. And so the more the the more we can keep them in Idaho, train them in Idaho, keep them in Idaho. Again, that's the whole idea of launch, is trying to to get the students to pursue post-secondary education and get some great skills and be part of our labor force. But it's still unknown if the labor force is actually going to shrink or if we're going to continue to grow. Again, not what you'd expect from a state that has had the highest population growth since 2016. So it's maybe, maybe not. One thing, though, that's occurring right now that we're seeing nationally is that we're seeing the highest percent of women who are in the labor force full time. We've seen, because of these lower birth rates, the percent of women who are working full time is the highest it's ever been, of those who are in the labor force. So women used to be, more part time, but we're seeing that change. But again, it's going to be offset in 20 or 30 years when potentially we have a lot more retirees than we have those entering the labor force. Nationally, there's an estimate of about 70,000 more people turning 65 every year than those who are turning 16. So potentially 70,000 more people leaving the labor force every year than those who might be entering it. And again, I did want to mention that this is a global phenomenon. We've seen China go from, one child rules, now they have 3 child rules, and they still can't get people to have kids. People, I think we're seeing a cultural shift, and that families and kids are not necessarily aspirations of a lot of people, and that's okay. And it's just going to be interesting to see where it goes, but it could potentially result in a lower labor force. And so when you think of all these employers screaming for people, it may not be readily fixed. But again, Idaho is probably on a stronger footing than a lot of its neighbors because we've had so much growth and we've had a lot of young growth. And so we have a lot of years of aging in front of us. But it still could be very, very apparent and clear that, we may not have as many students as we used to. And with that, sorry, do you want to do the survey results?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for that. Yeah, let's go ahead and pop the survey results up there, Lindsay, when you have a chance. And then we do have one question. So the expectation is that the 54% of you said it's going to increase, 29% decrease, and about 17% stay the same. So sounds like there's more optimism on that than what maybe Lisa was kind of conveying in her presentation here today. So, but I would say that, I think, Idaho is certainly, like you said, Lisa, that Idaho is certainly kind of in the leading edge in terms of population growth. And that's really kind of what's been the catalyst for our economic growth for the last few years and the enrollments. And I think, so I guess my question, let me start with a question for you that I have that, would enrollments in Idaho be increasing without in-migration in the last few years still, or is it something that without in-migration it would go down?
Without immigration, it would be going down because, again, we've seen very low birth rates, relatively speaking. And so, again, it takes 5 years from birth until we start seeing those kids enrolled. So, again, we'd be seeing births in the 2017, 2018, 19. And that's kind of those 2018, 2019, 20 are three very, very low years. And so it would, without migration naturally, with birth rates falling the way they are, we would actually be seeing significant declines every year. You would expect every year to see a smaller enrollment by grade than you did the year before.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'll ask a question from the audience here, and then one's kind of technical, is that, do you have the migration data broken out, measuring which age groups are moving to which region in Idaho?
I could. I don't have it at the moment, but I could certainly get you that data if you wanted, or direct you to where it's on the U.S. Census. But I could certainly either direct you to it or find that data for you for sure.
And then another is a kind of a partner, State Department of Education also wants to let us know that the enrollment data and historical attendance can also be found on their website. We can post the link in the chat there, Lindsay, if we can. It's www.ste.idaho.gov/finance. So, and then once you're there, scroll down to attendance and enrollment. And I think, another question we have also, Lisa, is that, it's kind of, I think it might be for those that are looking at this data a lot, like you and me, one of the questions maybe is just, it might be a bit of a, like, outside the expectation with the population increase we've been having, that enrollments aren't going up as commensurately. Would you want to talk about that a little bit more?
I think it's a shock. It even shocked me just to see. I just decided I was going to take the pandemic years when Idaho's population really went into extreme overdrive for population growth. And I was shocked to see that only 10% of Idaho's population growth was actually those under 18. As an economist, we think of families coming in and we think of, we think of population being somewhat evenly distributed when you think about age groups. And so when looking at this and that how it's not evenly distributed was a big wake up call of, geez, it's no wonder that, you know, this is crazy, because when you think of us being the state population, you really ought to think, geez, we need to start building schools in every district. We need to start increasing everywhere. And I think what it really became apparent to me is that yes, there's growth, but it's in pockets. It's not consistent throughout the state. It's not consistent by age group. And so we can't just take population as a whole. We really have to look at its components. And I think this is an extreme example because again, your population is growing very fast, but your young population is not. And so it was eye-opening almost to just see the stark differences from what I expected. I expected it to be actually more young, but it wasn't. And it just, the more I dove into it, the more I saw just how many school districts didn't have enrollment increases, and when you think about it, so 12 of 44 Idaho counties saw populations decline, whereas we had only 3 counties total that even saw a little bit of decline, and they were so slight, and they were very smaller populated counties. But so when you look in the inner workings of it, of seeing only 60% of school districts actually seen enrollment increases the last 3 years, it was just interesting to note that we're having different results happening when you look at the whole versus the parts.
And that might be getting to the previous question about how the immigration is filtering into the state, and kind of that concentration of differences might also be informing that. How would you respond to that?
So again, the in-migration, kind of what we're seeing a national basis as well, is just that it's the younger people that are filtering in, but they're looking for lower cost of living areas. So you're seeing a lot of people leaving New York and California and Washington, and you're seeing them heading towards places where home prices are lower, where cost of living is lower, where they're not so congested. And so we're seeing a trend of kind of going from the highly dense metropolitan areas to those suburban areas, of just, again, having more space. And Idaho is one of those, along with Montana and Utah, that we have more space. And it's drawing in some of those younger population. It's also drawing some of that older population as well. And so it's a mix, but it's hard to explain exactly why people make the choices they do. Every choice is unique, and behind every job is a person, right? And there's so many factors that go into deciding where to live. Schools are often one of them. The quality of education is often one of them, but it's not the only thing. So it's where you can buy a house and get a job and live comfortably and not pay exorbitant amounts in utility costs. And Idaho has the lowest utility costs in the nation. And so I don't know if I answered your question or if I went off on a tangent, but kind of seeing from those high areas of cost of living to lower cost of living areas.
And then maybe we can go back to one of your slides, but I just want to, for clarification, has Idaho's school population been increasing, or has it been decreasing?
Total enrollments have gone up every year except for 2020. So here is this what we're referring to?
And so the population is still increasing. It's just not by the same rate as the population.
Correct. So the school enrollment is continuing to increase, but it's slower. It's about half the pace of what we're seeing of population increase. So you would expect if the population were increasing by all age groups the same, you would expect to see it increasing at a similar level, but it's increasing by about half. And so, yes, it is still continuing to increase. And I think we'll see that probably for a couple more years. But the question is, though, a lot of this, offset the low birth rates that Idaho is experiencing was offset by high migration. And so if the migration changes patterns, like in 2020, it just amplified and the population growth accelerated significantly. But if we see that reverse, again, I think that's again going to be a sign that naturally, internally, Idaho's birth rates are lower than it was in the past. And there's not a lot of cultural trends that say that's going to reverse. If this was simply, if their low birth rates were simply due to the recession happening, see if I can find this. Here, that's gray bar. If that low birth rate was simply due to the unsure of what's happening in the recession, we would have expected to see it increase again following once we got out of the recession. It didn't. It continued to drop. And so I think we actually have cultural aspects in play of people choosing not to have babies.
Then we also have another state partner that provided us a URL link. Lindsay, can we put that in the webinar chat again? This is from our friends at the Office of State Board of Education, and they have a dashboard of college-going trends by district and post-secondary enrollments. So there's some more information that you can use there.
Yes, please check out the State Board of Education and the State Department of Education. There is amazing data there. Like I said, some of it's kind of buried and it's not super easy to find, but once you find it, it is awesome data to see and use. They've done a really great job of getting it out there and being transparent on their website. I loved it.
We have another question, which is, I'll just read it. We very frequently hear from parents in the Boise school districts that their schools are overcrowded. This seems to contradict the trend of declining enrollment. What are your thoughts that might explain the difference between perception and trends that you've demonstrated here?
Yeah, well, part of Boise's declining enrollment, the school district, is the fact that it has opened up charter schools. So it's opened up charter schools that are not part of the school district. So it's giving parents a choice. So some of that decline is not necessarily decline from their region. Some of that decline is also that students have left the school district, possibly because it was, we're crowded. But I think what you're seeing in general, I mean, even the city of Boise saw its population decline last year. And so people are moving from Boise Central to being in the suburbs like Meridian. And so you are seeing families in general saying, okay, there's too many people here. It's feeling too crowded. I'd like to go where I have a little more space. And so they're moving a little ways away. They're still in the metro area, but they're changing. And so it's hard for me being from the north. I haven't experienced the internal workings of a Boise school district, but from the numbers though, it looks like, again, your southwestern region has low birth rates, but it had higher birth rates in the interim. They probably will still be overcrowded, but there is a possibility that, again, with charter schools and with potentially declining enrollment, you might see them a little bit smaller. But again, Idaho's infrastructure wasn't necessarily meant for the growth that we're having. So even though, Boise makes up a lot of Idaho's population, it didn't necessarily expect to have as faster growth that we had. Yeah, maybe they expected that growth to be 10 years out, but we hit it in 5. And so I think it's also just that we have some congestion along with our roads, along with other things. Schools, of course, are going to feel the pinch too. And so it's all, the interesting thing about this is that the growth is not consistent and it's in pockets. And so there's certain areas that are busting at the seams in school enrollment, and there's certain areas that are just continuing to see school enrollment declines, and will likely continue to see the school enrollment declines.
And then we have one of our audience members that provided this insight also, which is Boise School District has historically offered open enrollment, so families in surrounding districts opted to send their students to Boise schools. So it's absorbing students from the surrounding areas, besides just they're in the district as well too. So they're seeking to send their students to Boise. And being from Southwest Idaho and Boise, I certainly know that's a dynamic. I remember even when I was in high school, that was like students that did that. So anyway, thank you for that. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up, Lisa?
I don't think so. I think the point is just that, you know, the demographics look like we could be headed for trouble, but we may not be. So my best answer is that can't always look at the data as a whole. You have to kind of take the pieces and see what's out there. But don't just assume that necessarily because we have a stellar growth in Idaho that everything is going to grow equally. Again, different decisions for different individuals. And I think that that's part of the beauty of Idaho too, is that there are some choices and decisions, and even just where you migrate to in Idaho is a big part of your decision too, and culture. So I very much appreciated it. I continue diving deeper in the data, but I appreciate the feedback, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa. And as the research supervisor, I would just add to that you know, Idaho's still a small state, doesn't take a lot to decide to move here to keep our numbers up. So that's
we're the 38th state in population. So we're still very small. So small differences make big impacts when you have small populations, when you think about that too. So
I would say to Lisa's point, I mean, we're globally and nationally, we're at this demographic kind of crunch that it's going to be a long process to see how that plays out. But I think certainly for now, the analysis at least provides us kind of shows how things are kind of a little bit different than what we were used to, I think. So one final note from one of our attendees is that there's another link for more information for State Board of Education. There's a educator pipeline report that will be coming out in a couple months. It includes similar data presented here. We posted online at the link that Lindsay will be posting on in the webinar chat there. So thank you, Lisa. Again, this is certainly compelling. I mean, it's really gets to how the demographics of people coming into the world and into the state really kind of drive what we can expect for the future. So that's certainly reticent to what we will be part of our life, as you said, is for a long time coming. So with that, I would say that you're invited to our next webinar, which will be on November 14th. I will be taking my turn at presenting. I'll be providing a retrospective on Idaho's economy over the last decade, and in the context of the long-term industry and occupational projections that we provide for the state. So join me on November 14th, and it should be a fun time. I'd also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared towards job seekers, employers, but also includes free access to labor market information at lmi.idaho.gov. And on that webpage, there's a top menu. You can find a variety of information that includes data and tools, which has several data dashboards, regions, where you can find a directory of one of our 6 labor economists in the area, including Lisa, as well as data sheets for Idaho's counties. And then also we have a new one that's webinars that will take you to our YouTube page and a list of the recording of this webinar, and also the ones we've done over the past year and other ones that Department of Labor has provided. With that, I would like to thank you again for your attendance. Hope you found this compelling, and happy Halloween. Good day, good luck. And also make sure you check out Idaho Launch at nextsteps.idaho/launch. So that's an important program, and it certainly fits well with what we're talking about and making sure we have the best skilled workforce that we can find with this scarce labor force we're going to be dealing with for our foreseeable future.